Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Hunter. I'm reading Ria's description. I am the Visitor Experience and Exhibit Manager here at the Swanner Preserve and Eco Center. And I am joined tonight by Ria Cohn and Mark Chynoweth. Ria is the Conservation Coordinator here at the Swanner Preserve and Eco Center. She deals with a lot of the things that happen out on the preserve, including when we see large predators and questions that we get about large predators. So she'll be a great addition to have on tonight. And both of us will be able to handle any questions that you might have. You're welcome to send us questions in the chat if you're having any technical difficulties or we're hard to hear or anything like that. And then we just have a few housekeeping things to go over before I introduce you to Mark, and then we'll get started. So first of all, if you have any questions during the talk for Mark, you are welcome to throw those into the chat or the Q&A, and Ria and I will field those as we go along. Mark's going to have 3 sections in his talk, so at the end of each section, we'll have some time for questions. So if you have anything and you're thinking about it, type it into the chat. You're also welcome to do the raise your hand button at the bottom of the screen. If you just scroll over the bottom of your screen, you'll see the raise hand or chat option. If you do raise hand, we can unmute you so you can ask a question if you're interested in doing it that way as well. And then I would also like to thank our sponsors. So this talk and our other walks, talks, and workshops are sponsored by Park City's Wrap Tax, which provides lots of awesome recreational arts and planning and parks operations all over the town and supports those. So we're very thankful to have them to be able to do things like this. So now to introduce Mark. Mark Chynoweth is an assistant professor of wildlife ecology and conservation biology in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University, Uintah Basin, and he is an educator and researcher whose work focuses on large mammal ecology and conservation in human-dominated landscapes. He hopes that his research will be used to guide conservation and management of mammals, specifically carnivore species, and protection of biodiversity at the ecosystem level. We all know that we've been seeing lots of large predators here in Park City, especially with everyone working from home and people being around their houses more. We are getting a lot more reports of large predators in the area, and they're an important part of our ecosystem. And so we're really excited to learn more from Mark about how we can be good neighbors to them and live happily together. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Mark.
Great, thanks so much, Hunter. I'll share my screen here, hopefully, and we can go ahead and get started. Let's see, and you can see that screen all right?
Yep, that looks great.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to join you all this evening. Of course, we wish we could be together, and I wish I could drive out to Park City and join you guys. But instead, we're all at home, comfortable, and I can talk to you from my office. And I'm going to tell you or talk to you a little bit about large predators as our neighbors. So this was requested by Hunter and Rhea as a topic for tonight. I do a lot of teaching here at Utah State University, and I like to keep my lectures and my classes fairly flexible. So please put your questions in the chat. I asked our host to interrupt me if it seems appropriate, and I can answer any questions that you all might have. I have quite a bit of material, and we'll see how far we get in, and we can always take a break and discuss whatever needs to be discussed. I am going to tell you just a little bit about myself as some background. So thanks for that great introduction, Hunter, so I don't have to read off all these departments and university things. I am based at the Utah State University Uintah Basin campus. So I live in Vernal, Utah, and work at the Uintah Basin statewide campus. A couple photos here. I've spent a lot of my career working with large mammals, and specifically with brown bears, gray wolves, and Eurasian lynx in parts of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But of course, we have analog species here in the American West. And now that I work for Utah State University, I am involved in a few research projects focused on some of our large carnivore species we have here, as well as I do a lot of teaching out here at the Uintah Basin campus. So I spend a lot of time with students and hopefully training the next generation of wildlife biologists. I've decided to break up our evening into 3 general categories. And so I'll start off very broad, very basic with some ecology, specifically about carnivores. But then I want to spend most of the time thinking about carnivore coexistence and how we try to measure that as managers and scientists. And then finally, to look ahead into the future. So try to think about, what might happen in the future in our backyards, as well as how we can react if we encounter some of these wildlife species out there on our hikes and bikes, et cetera. I do want to take a break after each one of these sections. And so if you have any questions, it'd be a great time to let me know. So again, we're going to start off pretty broad and just think about this idea of ecology, right? And we will talk about carnivore ecology specifically, but when we hear this familiar term, we think about the relationships between organisms that are living on our planet, as well as the way these organisms interact with the non-living world, right? Biotic and abiotic interacting together. And oftentimes we take ecology classes in high school, middle school, or undergraduate, graduate school, whatever it might be. And as we learn more, we understand how complex this field of study truly is. So on a basic level, we understand prey and predator relationships on some level, but as we add more and more species, it gets more and more complex. And I consider myself really to be a conservation biologist. That's where most of my training lies. And conservation biologists oftentimes discuss how easy it is for us to disassemble an ecological community. So whether that means building roads or towns or cities or whatever it might be, it's really easy to take ecosystems apart. Really challenging to put them back together again, right? And increasingly in the past few decades, there's been more and more efforts to try to do this. And we're learning more about how challenging that is and how complex these ecological relationships are. And hopefully we'll revisit that idea as we move through this evening. In terms of how ecologists and wildlife managers think about, currency and ecology, we oftentimes think about biodiversity, right? And biodiversity is the variety of life on our planet. And we measure biodiversity in a variety of different ways. I can go out into my backyard and measure my local level biodiversity in my lawn or my pond, whatever it might be. I can look at an ecosystem level, maybe out here in the Uintah Basin or Ashley National Forest or the High Uintah Wilderness, right? I can look at biome level biodiversity, so zooming out to the Intermountain West or some larger geographic area, or even global biodiversity. And so there's lots of fascinating ways we can look at biodiversity on our planet at all these different scales. And conservation biologists and wildlife managers work at a variety of different scales to try to achieve goals. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up, and I'll use an example, my favorite carnivore species here in Utah, the black-footed ferret. Now, I know you don't have these in Park City, at least I have not heard of any yet, but we do have them out here in the Uintah Basin. And so this is known as the most endangered mammal we have here in North America. And they had gone extinct in the wild, right? So we went out and captured all the known individuals in the wild and brought them into captivity, started a captive rearing program, and wanted to reintroduce this species into the wild, this carnivore species. Well, if we want to be successful as managers and conservation biologists, we need to think at a community scale, right? So how this ferret interacts with other species, including its prey species. So if we're not thinking about a community level scale and these relationships, our wildlife management efforts, our conservation biology efforts are not going to be successful. So in order to successfully reintroduce black-footed ferrets, we have to make sure there are intact prairie dog communities as their primary food source and actually their primary home, since ferrets live inside the burrows of these prairie dog colonies. Right. So related to this, I'm hoping that we can have somewhat of an interactive presentation. And so I wonder if, I'm looking here to see if I can access the chat myself. I'm not sure if I can, but that's okay. Oh, there it is.
Did you find it?
I see it now.
Okay.
So we have a chat box here, and I want to ask you all a question. And so you're not allowed to cheat during this presentation, so don't use your smartphone or your computer. But if you're able to and you're willing to share your answer to this question, I want to know how many plant and animal species live on our planet. And so take a moment, and what I like to do in my classes is do sort of a 1, 2, 3, go. So you can enter a number into the chat box, and then I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and hopefully you'll hit enter when I say go, and we can see what everybody thinks. So think about how many plant and animal species live on our planet. Usually I force my students in my classes to guess because this should be fun. Hunter and Ray, I have to respond too, you know. So I'll say 1, 2, 3, go. And when I say go, please hit enter and let us know how many species are on our planet. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. I got some great answers there, including I don't know, and that's actually the correct answer, right? We're not 100% sure. What we do know is that we've documented somewhere around 1.3 million species on our planet, but of course we have not discovered all the species on our planet. So really the most accepted estimate we have out there is 8.7 million projected species, plus or minus 1.3 million. So in other words, we really haven't discovered most of the living things that exist on our planet, right? All right, and why am I telling you all this? Well, remember that species and biodiversity is really the currency we use as ecologists. And we're talking about carnivores, and we only have 270 carnivore species on our planet, right? And so these are all of the mammalian order Carnivora. So we're not talking about the marine environments and things like that, but just mammalia. We only have 270 carnivore species. So of these species, they play a really important role ecologically. They provide a lot of ecosystem services. And I wonder if many of us have heard this term before, but essentially it means benefits that humans are provided by nature, right? Clean air, clean water, all the things that we need. And the list goes on and on and on, right? Food source, timber sources, et cetera. So what do carnivores provide for us? Well, they regulate populations of prey species, right? And that's basic ecology, basic biology that I bet we all are aware of, right? But we need to think hard about how carnivores contribute to ecosystem services. What do they provide for us as humans? And if we think about the ecological role that carnivores or large predators play, many of them are at the top of the food web. So here's a figure from a well-known scientific paper that looked at ecosystem relationships in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So we see a lot of familiar species there, including elk and coyotes and grizzly bears, wolves. And I think most of us are probably familiar with this system, or at least know of it, right? So what's interesting about this system is it gets a lot of attention, right? However, the scientific consensus of the role of wolves in this system really hasn't fully emerged yet, even though there's been 20 years of research by federal governments, state governments, academic investigators, right? There's still a lot of discussion in the scientific literature of the role that large carnivores, predators like wolves play. This is a very simplified figure here that's missing many different species that exist in that ecosystem. Right? We are learning some broad patterns that we see, especially in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So I want to share a couple of those that some of us may be aware of, right? There's another paper that examined 7 carnivore species across the planet and the interactions they have when they were absent from ecosystems. And so here we have 2 examples. On the left-hand side of the panel, we have sea otters in the 2 left-hand photos. And on the right-hand side, we have the gray wolf in Yellowstone. And if we look at the right-hand side, right, gray wolf recovery, when we reintroduced gray wolves into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we saw vegetation really bounce back. So no large carnivores in the system, right, elk populations can increase, and that causes a decrease in plant populations. Right? Similarly, with sea otters in Alaska, right, that top photo shows when sea otters are present, they actually keep sea urchin populations down. And sea urchins eat seaweed or kelp. And so if we don't have those sea otters, we have barren sea floors with no kelp or algae. Right? So we see a lot of different ways that communities respond to carnivore presence and absence. I do have a fair number of graphs and figures in this presentation. I'll do my best to explain them, but let me know if you have any questions as I go through. And I'm just going to pick certain parts of these figures to point out to everyone, right? And this next figure, I know there's a lot of small text on there, but the important thing is to look at this as natural experiments that help us understand the impact of carnivores. So we can't work in a lab in petri dishes, right, and add wolves and bears and things like that. So we have to have these natural experiments that have occurred around us, right? Things like what happened in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with the removal of wolves and then the reintroduction. And so here we see on this figure several different carnivore species from around the world. We see some familiar ones like wolves in the very middle of that figure. And all I want you to notice is that we see a big bar graph that's going in a left-hand direction that shows a decline of hardwood tree species in the absence of wolves. So if wolves are not there, right, we see hardwood tree populations decline, right? And similarly on the very top, the sea otter there, we have kelp declining, right? So that blue bar shows kelp populations declining, that's seaweed, and then urchin populations increasing, that orangish colored bar on the right-hand side. So all this is showing us is that when we remove these large carnivores from different ecosystems, we seem to see a pattern of the impact that has, right? I showed you a figure of the food web in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and that's all fine and dandy, right? But the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is a wonderful, beautiful, relatively natural place and does not represent the rest of the world. The system that we really live in and is being more accepted by ecologists and conservation biologists and wildlife managers really looks more like this. This is a figure from another well-known scientific paper that shows what our food webs really look like. So we still have these interactions. So you see wolves at the very top, and you see elk at the very left-hand side of that figure, and we see hardwood trees at the bottom, right? But in the very center, with radiating arrows out to every part of the food web, is human impacts or human effects. So that textbook figure that I showed you, that's, you know, what we see in middle school and high school with this nice little food web. Well, really what it looks like is that we are impacting most ecological processes on our planet, right? And related to that, we can think about carnivores on a global level. So we're going to talk a lot about Utah and the Intermountain West, but I thought it'd be interesting to share another figure from a paper that shows intact carnivore guilds. Now, maybe guild is a new term, but what that term guild means is just a group of species that exploit the same set of resources or use the same set of resources. All right, so carnivores are typically preying on a set of species like ungulates or rodents and things like that. But what we see here is that intact carnivore guilds or groups or sets of carnivores, right? So historically here in Utah, that included grizzly bears and gray wolves and lynx and maybe wolverines, right? Most of those are gone now. So if you notice where we have that red color where Utah is on the map, we see a little circle of that beige color where Yellowstone is. And then as we move farther north, we get into, closer up into Canada, and we see some intact carnivore guilds. Okay. Intact guilds make up only 37% of our land area on our planet, right? And 96% of all land on our planet, except for Antarctica, actually included at least one or more large carnivore species, which is pretty darn interesting. Right? So if we think about the impacts that large carnivores can have, what we see if we remove these animals is something called trophic cascades. And I find that term easy to remember or understand because it's like a cascading waterfall, right? If you remove the very top of our food web, we're no longer going to have those effects trickle down, right? So hopefully I helped explain that with some of the previous slides, right? We see an increase in herbivores, decrease in plants. That's a general pattern that we see. We see an increase in competition. So if we remove certain carnivore species, we see herbivores start to compete more directly, and we can actually lose other species. Right? So we can lose biodiversity, we can lose species. And lastly, we lose this landscape of fear. And maybe you've heard this term before, but if predators are on the landscape, they actually cause a behavioral change in a lot of herbivores. So this is the end of this, section on carnivore ecology. I know really basic, but hopefully I could share some of the current scientific literature. Do we have any questions that anyone would like to ask about that section before we move on to coexisting with carnivores?
Mark, I did see one question from another Mark about, says this time of year in Park City, we see a lot of pot guts. Uintah ground squirrels, they are really making themselves known in the past couple of weeks and coming out. Mark asked if this would draw the black-footed ferret here, or maybe was this a historical range of the ferret, and would those be a predator or a prey species?
It certainly could be. So it's unlikely to draw individuals of the ferret all the way out from the Uintah Basin to the Park City area. That's just really far. It would take generations for that to happen without any roads or human activity. And yet the range of ferrets did extend all the way up to the Wasatch Front there, that area. So I don't know about Park City specifically, but it's certainly a possibility. And I would say likely that ferrets were there historically. Yeah. So hopefully that helps answer that question. I did see another one in the chat here about the importance of landscape of fear. This is a term that's relatively new in the scientific literature, maybe 15 or 20 years old. But think about it when you see a herd of elk out on the landscape, they're going to behave a lot differently if wolves are present in that ecosystem. So they're going to try to stay out in the open because they know that predators are there and potentially going to be dangerous. Whereas if elk grow up in an ecosystem where there are no predators like gray wolves, and they're going to behave differently and actually go deeper into the forest and potentially have a larger impact on vegetation.
Wow,
Hopefully.
really interesting to think about and keep in mind, especially somewhere like Park City and the preserve, where it's a little different in its current ecological state than historically. I don't see any other questions for now, though, so
Great.
We're pretty good to move on.
Excellent. And one more thing to add to that, in Yellowstone, it's really been shown that elk, in the absence of wolves, actually go closer to riparian or river habitats and consume the aspen there and have a really big impact on river ecosystems. But when wolves are present, the elk really prefer to be out in open areas where they can see potential predators. Yeah, hopefully that helps. So I do want to spend some time talking about coexisting with carnivores. I know that was one of the goals of this this evening that we have together. And before we get into that, coexisting with carnivores is all about humans, right? And I already talked about the impacts that we have on our planet. I want to ask you another question, and this is a multiple choice question, right? And I'm asking you what the current human population is on our planet. And I'm giving you 4 options there, right? 330 million, 3.1 billion, 7.7 billion, 9.2 trillion. So same thing, think about what your answer is. And then hopefully you're willing to share either, A, B, C, or D in our chat when I say go. Since it's a multiple choice, I think we're ready. So why don't we just say 1, 2, 3, go, and share what you think it is.
Sorry. I just made loud noises coming back in.
That's all right. And so, these numbers there's a great book out there, an older book called The Numeracy that teaches us that the human brain can't really handle numbers like billions and trillions. They don't really make sense to any of us. They certainly don't make sense to me, right? But we have to try to, of course, use these numbers to understand how many people, how many plants, how many animals, et cetera. The right answer is C, or the closest answer, right? And that's an approximation. We can't actually census the world. So that's our estimate of how many human beings are on our planet. That first answer, letter A, is actually the estimated population of the United States right now. Okay. So why am I telling you this? We need to consider humans as an important part of the natural world, right? And if we look into the future, we know that essentially no matter what, we will have more people in the near future. If we go deep into the future, like 2100, well, 2100 is not that deep, right? But a little bit farther into the future, our confidence intervals for our estimates or projections kind of widen up a little bit, and we're not sure what might happen. But we know in the next few decades that we will certainly have more people. And what does that mean for wildlife? And I think a lot of us know the answer to this. So I know there's a lot of small text on this slide. It's not, that part's not important. What this academic paper, this scientific paper was documenting is examples of large carnivores that inhabit or persist in what we call multi-use landscapes. And, Park City is part of a multi-use landscape. In other words, it's not a national park. It's not a protected area. You've got a lot of different uses going on there. So these are just examples that illustrate the range of carnivore species that are sharing landscapes with humans around the world. So, we are not unique here in Utah with the issues that we face. And these problems with coexisting with carnivores are happening across the entire planet, right? If we zoom into Utah a little bit, we are the fastest growing state. We have the fastest growth rate in our nation. That's from the US Census Bureau from 2020. And if we look at our estimates into the future, a lot of us probably know that we are going to have more people here. We have more people being created here, right? As like our fertility rate in our own state, but we have a lot of people moving here too. So it's a combination of a lot of different forces, right? And so it's important to understand and think about what's going to happen in the future, right? So these issues that we have now are likely only going to increase in some sense. I want to think about what is coexisting with carnivores. And this is, not as straightforward as we all might think. So a lot of research groups have been thinking long and hard about what this means. And on the most basic level, it means shared landscapes, right? And that should make sense, right? We're coexisting if we're sharing the same landscape. And there's this citation there is a group of scientists that really are working hard to define this. The other is co-adaptation, right? And not all the time, but most of the time, that does mean human adaptation to carnivores. So of course, some carnivores can adapt their behavior, and we'll talk more about that, right? But humans need to adapt to the presence of carnivores. And then we need to think about and quantify and research tolerable levels of risk. So what do we accept in terms of conflict? For many species, conflict is essentially unavoidable. So do we have some level of risk that we're willing to accept? Lots of examples of this, right? And we've probably all seen images like this before, right? And I guess I want a yes or no question from everybody, another question. Are humans and grizzly bears in this photo coexisting? And that's a yes or no question. So same thing, think about it. Are we seeing coexistence here in this image from Yellowstone National Park? And so let's see if anyone's willing to share. So 1, 2, 3, go. So we see a lot of no's and a couple yeses there. I hope that, well, with the exception of those quantitative questions I ask you, there's no correct answer to this, right? It's more of a discussion question. They are sharing a landscape, right? But some of those the second two questions there could be some more discussion, right? I'd like to think a little bit more in detail about a species that, of course, we have here in Utah, which is a coyote, right? And we can think about, not just in Utah, but in Intermountain West, are landscapes shared? Well, a coyote lives in almost every part of our country, and actually their distribution is expanding, right, farther into the southeast over the past couple of decades. So I would argue, yes, our landscape is shared with coyotes, right? Is co-adaptation occurring? And this is where things get a little bit more challenging. With this example of coyotes, I would argue, yes, co-adaptation is occurring, at least for the coyote from their end. Right? They are adapting their behavior to live in suburban and even urban environments. They are changing when they come out to feed, they are changing what they eat, and they are generalists. So they can do this. They can switch prey items. They can change their schedule. Right? They are very adaptable. But are we adapting to coyotes? Now that's where I think the question is a little bit more complicated and depends on what area you're talking about, right? The way we treat coyotes here in the Uintah Basin is a lot different than the way coyotes are treated in Southern California. Are we adapting to them here? I would argue we're adapting to them less here than they are in other places like Southern California. So how much do I accept seeing a coyote run across my field? And there's no answer to that, but it's just something to consider. And lastly, do stakeholders consider the risks tolerable? And this is another gray area, right? Species dependent, as well as region or geographic area dependent. So stakeholders are just people who, basically have it comes from gambling actually, right? People who have some skin in the game. So if we're thinking about stakeholders with coyotes, that could include wildlife photographers, hikers, pet owners, ranchers. The list goes on and on, right? That certainly doesn't end there. So do stakeholders consider the risks of having coyotes tolerable on the landscape? So that's where I wish we could all be in the same room together, because it'd be a lot easier to, kind of pick this apart a little bit. But instead, I just want to, move forward and think about the large carnivores that we have here in Utah. So these are the species that we typically do encounter. Well, I don't want to say typically, because you're lucky if you get a chance to see a mountain lion, right? Or even a bobcat for that matter. But these are the species that we have potentially in our backyards, on our public lands that we can interact with. And I think it's important to just take a look at these 4 examples here, and we can try to answer those same 3 questions. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is how we should be thinking about if we're able to coexist with these species. So you can pick any one of them and just think, are we sharing a landscape with them? Right? And that depends, specifically how far you zoom in terms of geographic area, right? Are we co-adapting to living with them? Right. So is that carnivore or predator adapting their behavior, and are we as humans adapting our behavior? And lastly, that big question of risks. Are we changing our risk acceptance to have, what am I willing to risk if I want to have black bears on the landscape? And how much am I willing to risk, right? And this is where the situation gets fairly complex, because obviously different groups of people, different demographics feel very differently about this. I do want to go over some rare visitors, because I think this is really interesting. This is, maybe some of my own interests that I like to talk about. But I think it's important to think about, we have more than just these 4 potential large carnivore species, right? If you see some of these species that I'm going to talk about, make sure you let the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources know. I shared my email address, and I'll share their phone number for the Salt Lake City office at the end of this presentation. It'd be great if you want to call me and tell me, but I don't manage wildlife for the state, but I want to know, so you can send me an email. Right? I think it's interesting, right? We do have wolverines here, a couple recent sightings. Historically, they were present here in Utah, especially in the high Uintah wilderness. The last time before 2016 that a carcass was found was 1979. Right, but we've had a couple sightings, one on a camera trap in that photo down below there, and then we had a roadkill in Rich County as well, right? So people ask, are there wolverines in Utah? And I always kind of shrug my shoulders and say, well, there could be right now. It's possible. Very rare though, right? These species have home ranges of up to 250 square miles, even higher than that in some cases. And there's probably only 200 to 300 wolverines in the entire Rocky Mountains of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. But it's possible. Another question I get a lot is whether or not we have lynx here. And so I chose to, mention these species because I get a lot of questions about these, or somebody tells me that they saw a lynx and I say, well, show me a photograph. And they said, oh, I didn't have time to get out my phone or my camera. It's possible. Sightings of the lynx over the past 20 years are exceedingly rare. There was lynx hair that was found in the Manti La Sal National Forest in 2002. In 2004, we had a couple Canada lynx wander in from Colorado, and they were collared. That's how we know that. Nobody actually saw them. One moved through the Book Cliffs and actually north along the Wasatch Mountains, and one was even at the mouth of Weber Canyon. So is it possible that you could see a lynx? It certainly is. And make sure you snap a photo, right? And you can see a couple differences between lynx and bobcats, potentially some identifying factors there on this slide. I also get questions about grizzly bears, right? We don't have grizzly bears here in Utah. 1923 was the last confirmed sighting. Famous Old Ephraim, right? His gravestone's in Logan Canyon now. But that's the last time one was seen. It's possible in the future we could have grizzly bears back in Utah. However, in the near future, and if you talk to DWR biologists, it's very unlikely. One could wander down, from farther north. Right, large carnivores are famously wide-ranging species that disperse long distances, right? But it's pretty unlikely at this point. And of course, many of us know that black bears aren't always black, right? We can have brown black bears, cinnamon black bears, etc. And lastly, I did want to talk about that is a typo there. The last confirmed sighting was not 1923. I think that just came over from the other slide. I apologize for that. But we have the gray wolf, right? And so, and in fact, I have in my notes here that 15 to 20 individual wolves have been seen here in Utah over the last 15 years. Most of these have been along the northern and northeastern border. So we have wolf sightings here in northeastern Utah, and then in Rich County, up on the border of Idaho and Wyoming, there are sightings up there as well, right? And we get reports, like the state gets reports, and I even get reports here in northeastern Utah about wolves. You know, they look very similar to coyotes or coyotes, right? Some tips there if you're interested in how to distinguish between the two. If you do think you see a wolf, they are big. They're very large, noticeably larger than coyotes, right? But oftentimes it can be hard to see at a distance. But look at that simple weight difference of 25 to 45 pounds compared to 60 to 120 pounds, right? They're very, very large. I have gotten a lot of questions about this from the public, and really one of the key characteristics to look at is their head, their nose, their face, their ears. Because even though there's a difference in weight, a coyote with a winter coat can look like it weighs 80 pounds, right, with a nice thick winter coat. A small female wolf with a summer coat can look and may even weigh as little as 40 or 45 pounds. So it's actually quite challenging to distinguish between the two. Coloration, right? Both species have a wide variety of coloration. So here are two with similar coloration, but take a look at the face of the wolf on the right-hand side. Big snout, right? Nose size is a really good indication. And just another comparison there of just the size of the face, right? Again, the coats look really similar, a lot of similar behaviors in terms of their gait when they're running and things like that, but quite a big difference in that face size. So as someone who spent a lot of time studying wolves for my dissertation, and I continue to work on the species now, I always spend a little bit of time talking about wolves because I'm so fascinated. So I wanted to talk about this idea of wildlife encounters increasing. And Hunter, please feel free to interrupt me if you see any questions pop up or anything like that. I'm happy to take a break. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of the screens and chat and everything, so please don't hesitate.
We actually do have a couple of people with raised hands.
Sure.
Do you want to take? There's two. Do you want to take those questions?
Yeah. Is that something you can control? I'm happy to take them. Okay. Yeah.
So Abby, and I assume that Banks is on with you. I'm going to allow you guys to talk so you can ask your question. And I think you'll have to unmute yourself to be able to do it.
Yeah, I think we decided we're going to skip it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
So much.
Sure thing. All right, Bob, then I'm going to allow you to talk. And I think you'll have to unmute if you want to ask your question. Oh, you're unmuted for a minute. Try one more time. Okay, we'll move on then and let you keep going, and then.
Sure. There'll be more opportunities to take a break and ask questions.
Awesome.
So I think this is an interesting idea to kind of explore a little bit further. And we've had a lot of changes in the last year and a half that I am going to think about, or hopefully get us all to think about a little bit. You know, if we're thinking about wildlife encounters and if they're increasing or decreasing, a really important idea is that, you know, wildlife detections or wildlife presence, right? It doesn't just, you know, rely on the animal being there. It has to be observed. So lynx and wolverines are great examples of this. You know, is there a lynx in Utah right now? Probably not, but they're really cryptic species, really difficult to detect, even with technology like camera traps. So things have to be observed to answer this question of if wildlife encounters are increasing. And this is where this idea of the anthropause comes in, and maybe some of us have heard of this term. This is what's being used in the scientific literature right now, because we're classifying the last year as a time period that we're calling the anthropause. Anthro being human or human activity, like anthropology, right? The study of humans. And anthropause is a pause in human activity that we experienced over the last year and a half, right? And this has become a natural experiment that wildlife biologists and academics and university professors have been focused on intently over the last 12 to 18 months, right? This is an interesting figure from a paper that shows percent change in humans visiting parks. I think this is fascinating for a number of different reasons. Okay, a lot of the world, we don't have data. So that's that gray color. We just don't know. But we have a lot of areas like India, Australia, South Africa, a lot of South America, where we see this dramatic decline in humans visiting parks, right? So where maybe lockdowns are more intense or other reasons why people are not visiting parks during this COVID-19 pandemic, right? However, we see some blue colors of an increase in the number of people that visited parks, including Utah. And a lot of us probably observed this ourselves over the summer when we had, our parks got hit hard from around the country and around the world, right? A lot of places were open. People were able to go visit these parks, right? But we're seeing this really big change over the course of the last year in human activity and human behavior. And that goes without saying, but maybe that's a new term for a lot of us. It's new in the scientific literature, introduced in 2020, this idea of an anthropause. And we're seeing a reaction about this, right? So some animals, so these are potential answers to the response of we are seeing more wildlife activity. And some animals are changing their routines and their territories. That is absolutely happening. It's a little bit difficult to quantify, and a lot of research groups are working on it right now. We have photographic evidence that demonstrates this, right? Coyotes in San Francisco out in the middle of the day. This is dolphins in the Bosphorus, which is the body of water that divides Europe and Asia, right, in Istanbul, Turkey. And so dolphins are not necessarily a new species, but now they're getting closer to the shores, all right, or they were during the lockdown period. So we've seen animals change their routines. Right? That's definitely happening. We've also seen in the last 18 months that things got a lot quieter. So this is from New York City, right? And this is the average sound level in 2019, right? That to the left-hand side of the graph. And then of course, when we get into April of 2020, we see a dramatic decrease in just the street level sound that's in New York City, right? And this was observed across the entire world, not just in urban areas, but suburban areas as well as large parts of the ocean, right? As shipping containers and shipping really took a dramatic decrease. So this is another explanation that scientists are giving to why we see more animals. Some are changing their behaviors, their territories. It's been a lot quieter, so we can hear them, and they're expanding their territories a little bit. But the main explanation that we see is that we're finally paying attention, right? Animals have always been there, but they've just previously gone undetected. And there's multiple reasons for that, not just the pandemic, right? But think about the fact that we all have a computer in our pockets now with a camera that can shoot 4K video on it, right? So we are able to document things much easier. And we also have citizen science opportunities at our fingertips. We have people spending more time outside over the last 18 months because of the pandemic, and we're finally paying attention. Now, that right-hand photo is, hopefully makes you chuckle a little bit. That's not a real photo, but you may have heard in the past, pre-pandemic, that there was a problem with people taking selfies with bears. And a lot of people got seriously hurt, and the National Park Service had to put out an announcement saying, please stop taking selfies with bears, which I'm thinking, what the heck? How can people think that's a good idea? But I'm bringing this up because, of course, social media plays a really large role in a lot of our lives, whether we are active on it or not. And so people are posting more things, online, and we're seeing more things on our social media feeds. And so we're actually paying attention a lot more. I want to point out that behavioral changes are a real thing. So there's a lot of information on this figure, but I just want to point out a couple important parts. So the figure on the left-hand side shows activity throughout a 24-hour period, right? But this is pooled data, so it's the average activity of humans and wolves, right? And so we see that wolves in that dotted line are active more at dawn and dusk and nocturnal times when humans are on the landscape, right? And so wolves adjust their behavior to be more active at dawn and dusk, right? And the way that different species interact is similar to the way humans and carnivores might interact. So the figure on the right-hand side shows coyotes and wolves that also, coyotes want to avoid wolves whenever possible. Right? There's lots of studies that show this, that animals can change their behavior, especially carnivore species, especially their temporal behavior when they're active during the day, in order to avoid humans or other species that they want to avoid. Species that live near or within human settlements, they live there for a reason, right? They're already able to adapt, like coyotes, like black bears. And so they can change their behavior, their activity very quickly. So I hope that provides some explanation in the scientific literature as to why we seem to be seeing an increase in wildlife activity. So this is a pattern that's not just unique, it's not unique to Park City. And I'm not trying to say that y'all are not special, because you are, right? But we're seeing these patterns across the world. Scientists, wildlife biologists are trying to figure out why this is. And these are some of the explanations that have been proposed in the scientific literature. So I don't know if anyone has any questions about any of those ideas about coexistence. I'm happy to address.
It doesn't look like we have any in the chat, but I have one. So as far as those charts that you just showed, what were wolves, what timing were wolves out prior to that? Like, what is that compared to?
So we see this, a pattern in wolves that we see across a lot of carnivore species, that in complete human absence, a lot of these species would be active during the day. So when are prey species active for wolves? They're active during the day. It's actually can be difficult for wolves to find, elk herds that are bedded down at night. So they would like to be hunting during the day. We can see that in Yellowstone, right? You can go to Lamar Valley and those wolves have adapted to humans being present, right? So you can drive down the road in Lamar Valley and you can see wolves. So, and I'll tell you, I continue to work on a project in Eastern Turkey that's in a landscape dominated by ranching and farming and human activity, no protected area. The only time we see wolves is when we trap them to collar them. You will not see wolves. They are not present because they know that it's dangerous. So they avoid human activity. They're active only at night.
That's impressive. And do you think it's similar with coyotes in relation to humans? Because I know that we tend to only see coyotes at dawn and dusk or that's the most common time to see them on the camera traps or on the preserve. Do you think that's similar?
Yeah, definitely. And there's some really interesting work that Dr. Julie Young, who's at Utah State University, she's involved with, but looks at this question of how bold are coyotes. And we see that boldness is different in Utah compared to places like this is a nationwide study, in places like North Carolina. We have coyotes in the suburbs of Chicago. And there's so many factors at play here, but just to touch on a few, here in Utah, we have a bounty on coyotes, a $50 bounty. There's incentive for people to persecute coyotes, and we have serious potential property damage. So we can't discount the fact that coyotes will harm livestock. So we don't want to discount that that's important. So people are, controlling coyotes through a variety of ways, either through the incentive, through the bounty, or to legitimately protect their personal property. So we see a different behavior here in Utah compared to other parts of the country.
So maybe they're more cautious here because there is that bounty, and it's so like in the suburbs of Chicago, right? People are not coming out with their guns and potentially killing them in the middle of the day there quite so.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more likely that you'll see a coyote in the middle of the day in a suburb than actually in a sort of more natural habitat. because they're not being persecuted in that area. I don't know if anyone has been down, to Griffith Park in Southern California. So that's where you go. There's a big observatory and museum there. It's a beautiful place, and that you can also see the Hollywood sign from there. But it's a little patch of like green in the middle of all these suburbs. And I've seen multiple times, I've seen coyotes there in the middle of the day with people around. And that won't happen in Utah because the coyotes will be persecuted.
Wow, that's really impressive that they are so quick to adapt.
There's lots of great examples, including coyotes on subways in New York. They are increasingly bold when they're not at risk.
Interesting.
And that's a great question, Hunter, and it can come back to this idea of how we define coexistence. And so are people in Chicago or New York or North Carolina, are they co-adapting, right? So are they changing their behavior, and are they willing to have coyotes because they want to see wildlife around? And that's a big question in, with this idea of carnivore coexistence.
I love that. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Bob, Bob or Leslie, if you're on, if you still have your question, let us know and I'll unmute you. Just send me a quick chat. But another question that I have is, as far as humans changing their behavior, and I missed a little bit of the talk, so I might have missed this. If you did talk about it, let me know. But what are some of the things the behaviors that we can change that can be the most helpful?
Sure, and I do have, I'll touch on this a little bit at the end, but just to think about this, I wanted to include the standard recommendations, right, of not leaving food outside, bringing your pets indoors at night. But that behavior, is a choice that we have to make. If we want to live with these animals, if we want to coexist with them, then we have to make choices like not keeping our pet outside. And our pets, or maybe ourselves, would like to have that behavior, that convenience of having a pet in the backyard. But we have to make choices and adapt if we want to coexist. Right. So all those things are sacrifices that we're making, right? That, it could be easier to leave your pet outside, but the reality is that if this coyote learns that there's food in backyards, it's going to cause more conflict. And so that's the adaptations that we have to make as humans, if we want to have large carnivores on the landscape. And that question is a big one that depends on the community and the species. So.
Right. Cool. All right, we'll let you move on.
Great. And so I do want to make sure and leave some time if there's questions at the end. So I want to think about looking ahead towards the future. Our world is changing, and I've touched on this a few times already, right? There's a lot of information out there about trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. Now, there's a lot of papers out there about different parts of the world. This is from the Colorado Plateau, right? And so Utah is a fascinating place for a lot of reasons, but one is that we're kind of bisected in a diagonal way between being part of this big biome of the Colorado Plateau, highlighted in orange here, and then we have the Great Basin off to the west as well. All right, so these are major drivers identified in this scientific paper on the Colorado Plateau, but I think, or I hope that you would agree that a lot of these overlap with the Great Basin as well, right? And the Wasatch is like the dividing line there. So you're like right on the dividing line between these two big biogeographic areas, right? But we have climate change as a major driver, right? We have agriculture and grazing. That's a driver of change. We talked about human population growth. Recreation is something I'm going to explore a little bit further, and the impact on wildlife. And then we have oil and gas development. That's big out here in northeastern Utah, as well as many parts of the Colorado Plateau, and a lot of extraction activities like mining. Okay. A lot of papers explore and try to understand what's driving change, because if we don't understand what are the factors that are going to change the world around us, we can't come up with potential solutions. Right? Included, this is from a separate paper also exploring the Colorado Plateau, right? That we are unique in the sense that we have some tools to help solve problems, right? 75% of our land on the Colorado Plateau is federal or tribal agencies. Now, of course, there's a big discussion on the pros and cons of this, right? Public land. But if we think about it from the perspective of problem solving, it's much easier for us to solve problems if the land ownership, the land tenure, is all in basically one or a couple hands instead of a bunch of private property. Right? So again, there's a big, deep discussion there. But if we think about it just in terms of addressing major issues across large scale regions like this, that could be viewed as a benefit, right? We also have tens of millions of visitors each year, right? And so is that good or bad? I want to explore that a little bit further. Oftentimes it's viewed as a good thing because we want to maintain natural areas because that's a big draw for tourists, right? So if we don't have natural areas, then we might see a decline in tourism, right? What does all this mean for wildlife and carnivores, right? It's almost inevitable, right, that we are going to see loss of habitat, invasive species, increased human access. We're going to see an increase in conflict, disease, and I have highlighted here tourism and recreation, because I want to share a couple other recent studies that focus on recreation and the impact on wildlife in the Colorado Plateau or on the Colorado Plateau. Right? And again, I think this applies even though Utah is bisected by these two biogeographic ranges, right? And I know there's a lot of information here, but I'm going to tell you what these blue colors mean because that's the important part, right? What we see on the left-hand side in the text, if you can read it, is different types of recreation. So if I go down to the bottom, there's terrestrial recreation, which includes hiking and running, right? Wildlife viewing, biking, dog walking, etc. And those numbers in the green show the number of scientific articles that try to quantitatively address the impact on wildlife. So we have the most number of articles addressing hiking and running and its impact on wildlife. Now, the important part of this is the blue colored bars here, because what those blue colored bars are, the percent of results with a significant effect that's negative. So the only thing I want you to get from this article is this is trying to summarize all the information that's out there right now about the impact of outdoor recreation on wildlife. And we see the majority having a significant negative impact. The yellow color is significant positive impact. Okay. So some activities can actually have positive impacts, right? By increasing money available for a state park, for example, for habitat restoration. That's a potential, great potential positive impact of recreation. Right? And I love recreating outside, so by no means am I demonizing outdoor recreation. This is another figure from that same paper, right? And what this is showing is what parts of wildlife's behavior is being changed, right? And we have different population or individual level behaviors, right? Is it just, for example, the sheer number of individuals in a population, right? The abundance. But the overall result is the same, as that blue color is showing that most of these quantitative studies are showing a negative impact that recreation can potentially have on wildlife. So I wanted to bring this up just looking into the future, because this is something that I think the state of Utah needs to think about. I don't have any answers to how to solve these problems, and they're extremely complex. So we started off today talking about how complex ecology is, right? But then we're incorporating a human component, and of course things get even more complex. But this is something that is on the agenda to be discussed, you know, in discussions in the Wildlife Board, in other groups, other interest groups across the state. So I just have a few more things to share, a couple ideas I have if you're interested in getting more involved. And you know, talking to the folks at the Eco Center, you know, I think some of these you might be aware of, right? There's this great program called Wasatch Wildlife Watch. There's a link there, but if you just type those 3 words into your internet search engine, you'll be able to find this site. And this is an opportunity to be involved with monitoring through the use of camera traps activity across many areas, you know, in the Wasatch, right? And I wanted to share a map from that project. And this project is near and dear to my heart because I helped start it when I was a PhD student at the University of Utah. And now there's a great PhD student, Austin Green, who's in the lab that I came from, who's working on this project. And so I wanted to share this map that we used at the very beginning of the project. Right. And what we're looking at here, a couple of things that are important, right? We see all the major canyons along the Wasatch Front that I think a lot of us are familiar with, starting with City Creek as letter A up there and moving down through, you know, Red Butte, Parley's, Cottonwood Canyons, et cetera, Mill Creek, right? But the other thing is, so these are used in very different ways, right? So City Creek is used in a very different way with a single concrete road compared to Parley's with the I-80 running through it. But the other thing I wanted to look at is this land cover, right? And so you can see this big gray area, that's the Salt Lake Valley, right? That's no vegetation. That's how we classify it. All this is classified using satellite imagery. So that big gray area on the left-hand side of the map is all urban, no vegetation available, right? And then we see a yellow color, that's the wildlife urban interface. And you've probably heard this term before, right? Where city meets potential wildlife habitat. And the Wasatch Front's a great example of this. The other is the Front Range in Denver, right? So we have a few places around the country that really, that do look like this. But I think what's interesting is this red color, right? And here, this research group that generated this metric for development, they're calling it the Wildlife Urban Interface Intermix. That's a mouthful, right? It's also called X-Urban Development. And that's where Park City lies, right? Park City is X-Urban Development. And so I wanted to take a moment and bring this up because the reason why we're seeing a lot of wildlife activity is because we're building in wildlife habitat. So I end up driving through Park City and Heber City a lot. And I'm not saying anything is good or bad, but that is X-Urban Development. And I see the construction that's happening in wildlife habitat. And it's not unique to Park City. It's happening across Utah. It's happening across the Intermountain West and across the world, right? And we've even seen things change over the past 18 months. We see more people desiring that way of life. And so the reason why we're seeing more wildlife is because we're moving into wildlife habitat. That's absolutely one of the main factors I didn't bring up earlier because I wanted to bring it up now. Right. So going back, I'm going to go back a slide here. This is a great program. If you're interested in getting involved, I think a lot of you are aware of this. There's a couple of resources I wanted to share, right? Wild Aware is a great website that's operated by Utah State University. It has some excellent information there. There's all sorts of citizen science and community science opportunities. Since you're a part of this, this presentation tonight, you know how to access the other two folks on this call that can point you in all the great directions for more citizen science and community science. So instead of going through all the opportunities, I hope you don't mind that I'm putting you both on the spot. But I think that you can help out with folks finding local opportunities. A couple numbers there to call your local DWR office. Depending on where you live, it could be Salt Lake City, it could be Vernal. Summit County is also kind of on the border of a couple of regions for DWR. You can find these numbers online as well. And I wanted to end with a couple, and I've got a couple ideas here, right? When should you think about calling those numbers if you see something, right? As a general rule, right? Something as a species, an individual is acting threatening, aggressive, it's destroying property, right? Which includes physical property or living property like livestock or pets, occupying an area that could be dangerous of human development, like under a porch, right? Things like that. And really just generally acting odd, right? And we're all lucky to live I think we're all in the state of Utah. I'm not sure. Some of us could be joining from farther away, right? Beautiful place with lots of wildlife. So I bet a lot of us have seen wildlife, whether at the eco center or other places on hikes. So we might have a good idea when things are acting kind of odd, right? Just a couple more specific reasons. A cougar sighting should be really, or hopefully be really exciting, right? I've only seen them, truly in the wild a handful of times, right? But if it displays aggressive behavior, right, that's when you want to think about reporting it. Remember that these individuals within a population can adapt to human behavior. So we don't want these individuals to get used to being around humans, right? Same thing with bears. A bear observation can be a really exciting event. If you're up in Ashley National Forest or other parts of the Uintas or the Wasatch, it can be really great, right? But if we see any odd behaviors, something to be aware of. Some of those rare species that I mentioned, those are important to report, like gray wolf sightings, right? This is important for us to understand how wolves are actually, seem to be potentially moving closer and closer to Utah. And boy, I could talk for hours about this, right? We have a pack of wolves that's on the Utah-Colorado border right now in Moffat County, 40 miles from where I sit right now in my office. So the DWR wants to know about those rare species, right? And then we have a whole host of other species that could even potentially be of greater risk, like moose, right? And since a lot of us live in Utah, you're probably aware that moose can be incredibly dangerous, right? This is an example. If you see one anywhere near human settlements, really, you should give them a call and let those folks know. Lastly, these are, kind of responses that I think we're all familiar with, but it has to do with Hunter's great question, about are we willing to co-adapt to live with carnivores on our landscape? And depending on the species, depending on the demographics of a community, depending on the geographic location, we may be more or less willing to co-adapt. But this is what co-adaptation is. It's changing our behavior to share a space with these animals. And this has to happen if we want to have these populations persist, right? And I'm going to move on. I'm not going to read through all these because I think that you've probably heard a lot of these before and you can read through them. Not hiking alone, keeping your pet on a leash, all these things are important, right? Here's the second part of that list here. But this is what co-adaptation means. And we're not all going to go out and change our behavior right now. That's not going to happen. And some of us might be willing to, go through this list and change more of our behaviors than others. But the best thing we can do is, come to events like this and learn more about living with carnivores, how we can do it. We can try to teach other people about it if it's something that we feel strongly about and we want to communicate to others. But I think understanding the challenges and understanding how a lot of these processes of living with carnivores, wildlife biologists and managers are still trying to understand as the environment around us is constantly changing. We are going to have more people. We're going to have more recreation in Utah, right? All these things will happen. They will change. And managers are constantly playing catch up with these changing conditions. I want to end just by looking at, this is straight from my Principles of Wildlife Management class and the textbook that I use, right? This is how wildlife managers think about the world, right? We have wildlife populations in the upper part of this Venn diagram. That's why we all get into this field, because we love being outside and working with animals, right? And wildlife populations need habitat and environment, that lower right-hand corner of the Venn diagram, right? But the left-hand circle of humans, right, is growing more and more all the time, and not just in population, right, but our impact on the environment, the challenges that we're bringing to managing wildlife populations. So this is what we teach at Utah State University, right? And this is what wildlife managers across the world learn, is that this is what we call the three-legged stool, or the wildlife management triad, right? We consider all these things in human dimensions as becoming an ever-increasing component of wildlife management. A lot of you probably know Aldo Leopold, right? He was the first wildlife biology professor at in our country, at University of Wisconsin at Madison. Of course, wrote Sand County Almanac, right? 1943, he said, the problem of wildlife management is not how we handle animals. The real problem is one of human management. So I think with that, I'll finish up, and hopefully there's time for some questions. Happy to try to answer anything that folks have. But the last thing I'll say before I take any questions is that I tried to provide some information to hopefully let you think about coexisting with these animals, and maybe pique your interest to dig up more information. My email address is there if there's anything I can do to help. But if you do see wildlife or anything you're concerned about, please, of course, call the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. So yeah, with that, happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. I'm going to do a quick plug for a citizen science activity that's coming up, and then we have a question from Louise that I'll ask you. At the end of the month, end of April into beginning of May, is the City Nature Challenge, and it happens on iNaturalist. And it's a way for anyone to observe nature that is happening right in your backyard or at your home or in your local area. And it uses iNaturalist, which is that just an app on your phone. It's free, and you can just go to org to learn, and it's a whole competition between a variety of cities to see who can observe make the most individual observations of the natural world. And it's not like your garden plants or things that we've cultivated, but it's if you see a bird in your backyard or an insect or a plant that's just growing naturally, then you can do that. So we're the Wasatch is the area that we're located in. So if you're in Park City or in Salt Lake, and anyone is able to do that. So and now we'll go on to Louise's question. So Louise wants to know, where does the pine marten fit and what is their status? And then she says, Barbie Ranch in Emigrant, Montana has cattle in grizzly habitat and encourages the wildlife. I think maybe she's wondering about like what area of the food chain the pine marten is in. And
yeah, and so we put that in the term that we use to describe species like pine martens is a mesopredator, just meaning sort of a mid-level predator. And there's lots of interesting interactions between those middle predators or mesopredators and larger carnivores or predators. And so their behavior, their potential prey species. So for example, wolves and coyotes will eat a pine marten. Right? If a pine marten runs across them on a trail, that's pretty unlikely, right? Because pine martens are, of course, elusive themselves, and smart little buggers. So they'll keep away from those large animals. But just like the maybe more well-known example of wolves controlling coyotes, right? We see species like coyotes and even raccoons and things like that controlling species like pine martens. So hopefully that makes sense. And this goes back to the idea that ecology is really exciting and complex, right? The food webs that we learn about are important, and we should be learning about them. But as you get deeper into researching them, they're incredibly complex. So the status of a pine marten here in the Wasatch, or I say here, over there in the Wasatch, the way that population behaves might well be different from one in California or from even here in the Uintahs based on what other species are present. Are there coyotes there? Are there bobcats there? That sort of thing. And then I think that's just to follow up on a ranching operation that encourages wildlife. There are so many great examples of private property owners that work together with state and federal agencies and private nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund to basically maintain habitat and then co-adapt, right? So they use non-lethal approaches, like for example, we've seen here in the Western US an increase in the use of guardian dogs. So guardian dogs are an excellent non-lethal approach. They keep wolves and other predators away without killing them. Range riders, right? Just hiring shepherds to stay with flocks. So many examples of great farming, ranching operations that really are going the extra mile to co-adapt, right?
Thanks so much, Mark. Really interesting content, and I think maybe we'll have to have you back sometime for a talk about wolves in particular, because I know a lot of people are interested in that, including myself. And just want to plug that we would love to see your sightings too. If any of our attendees tonight are in the Park City area near the preserve, we love hearing about what you're seeing. Hunter and I only have so many eyes, so we love getting word of what you're sighting in the area, and that helps us stay informed as well. And we'll also be sending all these contact info links out in a follow-up email. But Mark had a question about jaguars. Jaguars have been spotted in Arizona recently. Is it possible that they could move into southern Utah?
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. I think really very, very unlikely. Southern Utah is just a little bit too cold. So that's one issue that would prevent jaguars from making it all the way up here. The other one is just crossing all the human development, right? And that's just a reality. And that's similar to the grizzly bear in that sense, where, it's not that a grizzly bear wouldn't have enough food here in the, Uintahs, for example, but for an individual to make it all the way down here is pretty darn unlikely. And so that's I guess I was just trying to draw a parallel to another species that we have in the area.
Totally. Thank you. I think that those are all of the questions that we have. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that your presentation was so well laid out and it was easy to understand and you made it all just so clear and it was wonderful. And we, like Ria said, we will be sending out a follow-up email. There will also be a link to a survey in that. So for all of you who are watching, if you can take a couple minutes to fill out the survey, that really helps us to figure out what other lectures to bring in, how we can improve this programming, and then just to know a little bit more about what you're interested in. So please take a moment to fill that out and look for our follow-up. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. Thanks to the two of you and all of our attendees. So don't be a stranger. Come out and visit in Vernal.
Definitely. And we will look forward to it. I can't wait until we can have in-person programming and have you back for something here at the Eco Center.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Have a great night.